big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leese.
It's September 30th, 2022, and welcome to Leaders on the Frontier. My name is David Leese, and I'm delighted to be your host. Our topic today, COVID-19 and the Great Barrington Declaration. So I want to set the stage. On October 4th, 2020, a landmark declaration was released by three of the world's most eminent public health policy experts, inviting others to sign this declaration. Known as the Great Barrington Declaration, named after the place it was signed, which it stated as infectious disease experts, we have grave concerns about the damaging physical and mental health impacts of the prevailing COVID-19 policies and recommend an approach we call focused protection. As of September 2022, approximately 950,000 scientists, healthcare providers, and other leaders worldwide have signed the Great Barrington Declaration, shattering earlier claims by leaders of the COVID-19 response that there was a, quote, consensus on many issues, including the efficacy of lockdowns. The declaration represented really a profound departure from the approach taken by so many jurisdictions around the world, including Canada, that undertook in many cases, harsh measures, including mandates and lockdowns. Ironically, despite these lockdowns and mandates, Canada experienced some of the highest levels of mortality from COVID-19 in comparison to other developed nations, and spent more money than almost any other OECD nation. In other words, a major failure of public policy. So our guests today are Dr. Bhattacharya, a professor at Stanford University Medical School, a physician, epidemiologist, health economist, and public health policy expert focusing on infectious diseases and vulnerable populations. Welcome, Jay.
Thank you, David.
And Dr. Martin Kulldorff was a professor, and he's currently on leave from Harvard University. He's a biostatistician and epidemiologist with expertise in detecting and monitoring infectious disease outbreaks and vaccine safety evaluations. He's now a senior fellow at the Brownstone Institute. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Kulldorff.
Thank you so much, David. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you.
Well, I'm delighted to see both of you. It's been terrific to get to know you. We met at a number of meetings in London, England, of all places. So it's been, I'm just so appreciative that you could join us today for really what we hope to be a fairly far-reaching discussion. So I did want to set the stage briefly. Do you remember where you were when you first heard about COVID-19 and what went through your mind?
So I do remember. I was at my house and I was reading reports. I think it was in late December 2019, and it was reports out of China of this potential new SARS-like pneumonia. And I thought to myself, okay, we need to learn a lot more about this. If it's like SARS, it's going to be a potentially a pandemic, and we're going to need to see who's vulnerable, what the right measures ought to be. It never occurred to me that there would be a lockdown. That's not what got rid of SARS-1. I was thinking this is going to cause a lot of damage and harm, but I wasn't thinking anything on the scope that it turned out to be.
Interesting. And what about you, Dr. Kulldorff?
I don't remember when I first heard about it, but the thing that struck me was when we had the outbreaks in Italy and Iran, which was the first places outside of Wuhan where there were a major number of cases. Mm-hmm. And at that point, as an infectious disease epidemiologist, it was obvious to me that this would be a worldwide pandemic. It would reach all countries, and there was no way we could stop it from doing that. And I was afraid at that time for about 10 minutes.
Pardon me, 10 minutes?
Yeah, so for 10 minutes I was scared.
Okay.
But I quickly looked at the data from Wuhan, and looked at the mortality, and I could see there that there was a lot more mortality in older people and no children. So I did some back of the envelope calculations, and I quickly concluded that the risk of mortality was more than 1,000 times higher in the old versus the young. And I'm a father, I have 3 children. And if you're a parent, you sort of realize that what's more important than your own life is the life of your children. And at that point, I realized that they were going to be safe. They would probably be infected, but they were not going to die from this disease. And it took me about 10 minutes to figure that out. And after that, I haven't been scared.
Interesting. And you say that as a biostatistician, is that right?
Yes. I'm
Okay.
an epidemiologist. So that was very obvious from the data in Wuhan. We didn't know at that time what the infection fatality rate was going to be, but the relative risk by age was already very clear, which meant that this was not a dangerous disease for children or young adults.
Okay. So just to put,
Martin was very fast with that. I have to say. So for me, the question was how widespread it was going to be. I agree. When the data started coming out of China and Iran and then Italy, it was really clear that the disease was spreading very widely. The question was how widely. So in the early days, I started I had this hypothesis that the disease had spread already pretty widely, and I wrote an op-ed in March of 2020 in the Wall Street Journal, putting forward the hypothesis, and then calling for a set of studies called seroprevalence studies, the studies of how widespread antibodies to COVID were in the population, to immediately be done, so we could assess both how widespread it already was and also how deadly it was. And I agree, it was clear even then, and as Martin said, even earlier, that there was this enormous age difference in the mortality risk from COVID.
So just to pick up those threads, and I say this as a quote layperson, but if we look at the definition of a pandemic, what is that definition, and how did this meet the terms of that definition?
The definition of a pandemic is an epidemic that's worldwide, that reaches the whole world. And you get it when you have a new virus, for example, and the population is susceptible to it. That means they haven't been exposed to this virus before. So you don't have the immunity in the population that will keep it down. So therefore you get an epidemic, and if it's worldwide, it's a pandemic.
Okay, so picking up on that thread, though, you can have a pandemic, but with a relatively low mortality rate. Is this correct?
You can. So a flu, for instance, is a pandemic in that sense worldwide, every year. More not during COVID, but like every year before that. So the question is, what damage is the agent going to do, and what's the right strategy for trying to mitigate that damage? Those are going to differ based on the characteristics of the virus, the response of populations to it, a whole host of other things. The right response, even to a very deadly disease, is not lockdown. I mean, that's actually generally not the idea. The right idea in the context of any infectious disease pandemic is to identify the high-risk people, and then deploy resources, deploy scientific studies, deploy development of vaccines or therapeutics to address the risk where it's most acute. And I think that's the general strategy in the context of any pandemic.
So in this case, based on your extensive experience, both of you, in terms of looking at these types of public health issues, what was different when it came to COVID-19? I mean, I recall monitoring Chinese media as well in the fall, certainly in December. And it was very, very curious. There seemed to be a lot of mystery and speculation that somehow this originated from bat caves to all kinds of ideas. What made COVID-19 different in your experience when in comparison to other viruses?
Well, there's two things. One is that it's a very serious and deadly disease among older people. And one reason for that is the other thing that makes a difference is that we had not been exposed to this virus before. So therefore, there's very limited immunity in the population to it. Once then you've had it, you can get it the second time, but then you've already built in immunity that protects you from severe disease. But the first time you get it, since this is a new virus, there is high mortality among older people. So it was a very serious thing when this came. It was a very bad thing.
So when you look at COVID-19, is it apparent now in retrospect where this came from? Are we pretty clear on that? I've seen so many reports and speculation, but is that clear in your minds?
I think that there is still debate within the scientific community on that point. I don't want to misrepresent what's happened in the scientific community. I think there are people, partisans really, on both sides of this issue. So one group thinks very strongly that it must have arisen in a wet market in Wuhan, coming out of bats, kind of like how SARS-1 developed. And another group very, very strongly believes that it was the result of a lab leak where the lab leak took place again in Wuhan, China, from a set of experiments done to increase the functionality of viruses with an eye toward predicting which viruses in the wild are likely to make the jump to humans and to develop vaccines rapidly. And that in the context of doing that research, there was a lab accident, more or less, and that lab accident spread this dangerous virus to the population at large. Those are the two views in the scientific community. I wouldn't say it's resolved, but I will say that looking at the evidence around the cover-up of the second story in the early days of the pandemic by people who ought to have known about whether we had actually supported that gain of function work, it makes me deeply suspicious. The context is people like Tony Fauci and Francis Collins at the NIH had for a decade supported these kinds of gain of function work. And they spent the early days of the pandemic systematically organizing a cover-up of the possibility that it was a lab leak. That makes me deeply suspicious. I personally, based on both the scientific evidence I've seen and based on the fact of this cover-up, is making me lean toward a lab leak as the right hypothesis. But I do think that this needs the world deserves a thorough and honest investigation, and I don't believe that we've had one thus far.
Well said. So if we were to, I know it sounds hard to believe that this is going back some 2.5 years ago, so it's hard to remember the myriad of details and the chronology. But if you were to summarize kind of your observations regarding the responses worldwide, I know there was various responses, but there tended to be, the response tended to lean heavily in favor of, frankly, draconian lockdowns. So what were your observations of how the health authorities were responding to this?
The world went mad.
The world went mad.
We have principles of public health. One principle is that public health is not just about one disease like COVID, it's about all aspects of health. So you can't focus all attention on suppressing one disease like COVID and then ignore the harms on cancer, screening and treatment, or cardiovascular disease outcomes, of diabetes treatments, of mental health, and education and those things. That's not public health. Another principle of public health is that you have to look long-term. So yes, with lockdowns, you can push the pandemic into the future a little bit. You can sort of push the problems forward a little bit. And there's some sense to that because you don't want everybody to go to the hospital at the same time. But to just delay the pandemic, that doesn't give you any long-term benefits, any benefit in the long time. So I know, for example, Sweden did not lock down. They took measures for protection, but they didn't do a lockdown like the other European countries and the US and Canada. And they were heavily criticized for that. But that turned out to be the right response. There is much less collateral damage from the lockdowns and other restrictions. At the same time, Sweden has one of the lowest excess mortality rates in the world during these 2.5 years. So I think Sweden took a much more sensible approach based on public health principles, together with a few other places. For example, in the U.S., Florida, they locked down in the beginning, but then they reversed course. And another example is the Faroe Islands, which is a small group of islands in the North Atlantic. Well, there are a few examples like that. The third principle is public health is about everybody. So with the lockdowns, we protected the laptop class, the professionals, scientists, journalists, bankers, lawyers, and so on, who could work from home. But we didn't protect, we protected them even if they're young and they don't need protection. But we didn't protect store clerks, cab drivers, and so on. Many of whom are in their 60s and therefore at high risk. So we protected the professional class, but not the workers and the common people.
Yeah, so really profound violations of what we would commonly understand as important principles of public health. It's really astounding, isn't it?
Yes.
Dr. Bhattacharya, were you going to comment as well?
No, I think the lockdown strategy that we adopted was adopted effectively in panic and in emulation of the Chinese strategy. The World Health Organization sent a delegation to China in January 2020, and the delegation came back effectively concluding that what China had done had worked, that its very harsh, draconian, civil rights violating lockdowns had successfully gotten rid of the disease. And then they were people in the world around the world, legislators around the world leaders around the world looking at Italy and seeing an absolute horror story. They were seeing coffins lined up in cathedrals, absolutely overwhelmed hospital systems. It's incredible damage from this disease that appeared, and of course from the reaction to it. And the conclusion was, well, everyone should copy what China did. That's the only way to address the disease. It was incredibly short-sighted. What China did not work. It did not actually rid the world or even China of the disease. Not really. The disease is too easily transmissible. I believe it's spread by aerosols through the air, and it's very, very difficult to stop a disease like that. It was clear from the earliest days of the pandemic, even as early as I'd say February 2020 or late January 2020, that this was not SARS-1. We were not going to get rid of the disease. It wasn't going to just disappear. It was going to, as Martin said, spread through the whole earth. And so to adopt a lockdown strategy, it just wasn't sustainable. And as Martin said, it was focused on protecting a certain class of people, in effect, at the expense of everybody else. It was a tremendous, enormous public health mistake. I believe the single worst public health mistake in peacetime history.
Oh my, that's quite a statement. So even on a practical level, like the whole imposition of mask wearing as an example, I have seen 38 summaries of the efficacy of mask wearing. Is there really any efficacy? I have yet to find a study that shows that.
There are two. The gold standard of scientific research is the randomized controlled trials, where you randomize some people to, in this case, wearing a mask, and others will not wear the mask. And there has been two randomized trials on masks for COVID. One was in Denmark. It did not find any significant reduction in COVID infections among those people who were wearing the masks. The other trial was in Bangladesh. They randomized whole villages to either wearing masks or not. They found with a confidence interval a reduction between 0 and 18% of wearing masks. So basically, there's no benefit or very limited benefit of wearing a mask. So we know that mask is not a good strategy for controlling this disease. If there is an efficacy, it's very small.
So what if I wear an N95 mask?
Well, the physics of it look like this. So if you are wearing a mask, like let's say you're wearing a cloth mask or even an N95 mask, if it's not well fitted, the disease is spread by aerosols. So, I mean, that aerosols are like clouds, droplets are like the rain. Masks are okay at stopping droplets, spit, but they're not very good at stopping aerosols. if you wore a mask and your glasses fog up, well, that's aerosols escaping and virus escaping with it. Unless you're wearing a fitted N95 mask, which means it's going to hurt. It's going to be very tight around your face, so that it's completely sealed, that your glasses won't fog up. Unless you're wearing that, and it's not wet. If it's wet, the efficacy against protecting it going through the fabric of the mask also declines. You're not getting very much protection. And certainly, as Martin said, the evidence is from randomized studies that cloth masks and surgical masks provide almost no protection, or very limited protection. Places that have adopted the mask mandates have not seen substantially different long-term outcomes from the disease spread than places that didn't.
So there has been some studies also claiming that mask works. So, for example, there was a study out of Duke University, North Carolina, that was promoted by the New York Times. And what they did, they looked at different schools, and some schools had social distancing and some did not, but that didn't make a difference in terms of the infection. But all schools where the kids were wearing masks, and there were very few COVID cases. So they concluded that the reason there were very few COVID cases must be because they were wearing masks. Now, all of these kids were also wearing shoes. So we could discuss whether it was the mask or it was wearing shoes that protected them from COVID. Or we could compare with some kind of a control group like Sweden, where the kids did not wear masks. And during the first big wave of the pandemic in the spring of 2020, Sweden was the only major Western country to keep schools open for all ages 1 to 15, daycare and schools. And of those 1.8 million kids, none of them were wearing masks, no social distancing, no testing. There were exactly 0 deaths from COVID. So the problem is that the good studies, the randomized trials, show that there's little to no efficacy of masks. But then you have these stupid studies that are used to claim that mask works, even though they're nonsensical in terms of the scientific.
That's fascinating. Now, Dr. Koldorf, you've written extensively on the whole approach by Sweden in terms of this pandemic. How has that debate emerged? Is it pretty clear now that Sweden went the wise approach in terms of managing COVID-19?
I think it's crystal clear now that it wasn't perfect, but that Sweden took the right general approach and the right principles. And of course, in 2020, Sweden was heavily criticized, but now nobody wants to talk about Sweden anymore because it proved that Sweden was right and all the other countries, or most other countries, were wrong. Right. There were some problems, especially in the beginning of the pandemic in Stockholm. They had problems in the nursing home. They didn't properly protect the older nursing home residents. So that's very tragic. So that was a problem in Sweden. I also think there was a problem that they did close some of the high schools for a while, and I don't think they should have done that.
So are there other positive examples we could learn from, quite frankly, like Florida, as an example, has been held up as a positive one? Is that something that we should look to?
So Florida and Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, very early was a skeptic of the lockdown-focused approach. He did close the schools initially in the spring of 2020, but then in May he started opening up society, and then in September of 2020 he basically opened up the rest of Florida. In particular, he made sure that children in Florida actually had in-person schooling all through 2020, all through fall of 2020 and into 2021. Unlike California, where I live, where it was incredible restrictions on schooling. Most kids had schooling via Zoom or remotely. The consequences of that. He also worked very hard to protect older people. Florida has a very large older population, much older than California, for instance, therefore was likely to be much more vulnerable to COVID. You're going to see more deaths just by dint of in Florida from COVID, just by the fact that they had such a much higher fraction of their population is older. And so what Governor DeSantis did is he recognized that when the vaccines came available, he prioritized rapidly getting the vaccines into the arms of older people. By the end of January 2021, I think he had offered the vaccine to literally every person over the age of 65 in Florida, which is much more, in California, it was much more delayed. But it wasn't until March of 2021 that my mom, who's 83 at the time, was given the vaccine, and she lives in Los Angeles. So you have this focus on protecting older people, that's focused on keeping schools open, and it worked. If you compare California and Florida, the age-adjusted mortality from COVID per capita is almost identical throughout the pandemic. In 2020, it was actually lower in Florida. And if you compare the all-cause excess deaths through the pandemic, it's lower in Florida than in California. Now, I have to say, it's high in both places. I don't think the United States as a whole did very well. But there's no evidence that the lockdowns and other restrictions imposed in places like California had any effect on the long-term outcomes of the health and well-being of the population in terms of COVID, and certainty that it harmed the well-being and long-term outcomes of our children.
I think what the governor Ron DeSantis did was both very wise and courageous, because just like Sweden, he was heavily criticized for what he was doing, but eventually other governors started to pick up and mimic what he was doing. So I think he had a profound influence not only in Florida, but on the whole of the U.S. And it's interesting to note that these two sort of exceptions, one, because public health policy shouldn't be like a political issue, and we note that Ron DeSantis is Republican, so he's on the right. But Sweden, who did also the same approach, has a social democratic government, so on the left. Mm-hmm. So both people on the left and the right can get this right if they want to, and both politicians on the left and the right got it wrong in many different countries.
So what a great observation, and frankly, one of hope. So if we could just back up for a sec about the declaration itself, how did that come about? And then can we dive into a little bit the elements, the point, if you will, of the declaration? How did it come about?
So I was very frustrated that there seemed to be a belief, both in the media and politicians and others, that there was a consensus in the scientific community that lockdowns were the right way to go. And in my infectious disease epidemiology colleagues that I talked to on a personal basis, they had very similar views as I did, most of them. There were a few exceptions. So it was very frustrating that the journalists and politicians thought that there was consensus for this lockdowns that went against the principles of public health. So the idea was to try to invite some scientists and journalists to have a longer discussion to sort of let journalists understand better how public health and infectious diseases work. So we had such a meeting and we did some videos, and I invited Jay Bhattacharya and also Senator Gupta from Oxford University. But when we were there a few days before, we thought maybe we should also write, like a one-page declaration, the three of us, since so we did that. It wasn't planned long in advance. We only started writing it a couple of days before it was signed. It was just our own initiative, so our host didn't even know about it, that this was coming, until the day before, when they saw that we were working on it. So and I think of all the things that are written in science, this is the least novel thing, because it's all basic principles of public health. Mm-hmm. I think it did succeed to break the bubble of that there was scientific consensus, because before there were many people that spoken out, including the two of us. But if it's one person, it's easy to dismiss. So somebody would say, well, that person is not an epidemiologist. But it was very difficult to dismiss the three of us, because there were three of us, and we all work with infectious disease epidemiology, and we are all at reasonably prestigious universities. So it was impossible basically to dismiss this, and that's exactly what happened. So it was attacked fiercely, but the key thing was not that it was attacked or promoted. The key thing was that people could understand that there was not consensus for this nonsense that was going on.
Wow, that's brilliant. What are your memories of that time, Dr. Bhattacharya?
It was the most remarkable event in my life in terms of my professional life.
Wow.
I mean, I think what Martin said is right. That, like, it was really clear to me that that there was a lot of dissension among scientists about whether lockdowns were the right strategy, and that view had not really been told to the public. And so when three professors, in reasonable universities, I guess, Stanford, Harvard, Oxford, write this, and then tens of thousands of other epidemiologists and scientists and doctors sign on saying, look, the lockdowns are a very damaging thing. Focus protection is an alternate strategy that would work. Let's stop hurting our kids. I think when that happened, it sent a very clear signal to the public at large that we should really be having this discussion. We shouldn't just be launching into another lockdown, which was obviously coming in October 2020, without that open discussion to say, is this a wise course? That was the goal, was to start a conversation in the public at large and among public health, both about the wisdom of the lockdown and also a conversation about how best to protect vulnerable older people. So to me, it was just an extraordinary time. And I agree with Martin, it wasn't particularly original. The ideas were actually the ideas that had been followed for over a century of respiratory viral pandemics, where we use focus protection principles to protect the public with the idea that you don't disrupt society at large, because that actually ends up harming the public more. We were just calling for a return to old ideas, old and effective ideas in managing public health during a pandemic.
No, precisely. Well, I remember this time very well from a distance because the silence was deafening, and the kind of the mono constant drumbeat that lockdowns were the way to go. It was almost shocking how little debate there was. If we think at Frontier, it's very important to consider all the kind of policy options, the principle of neutrality, and that wasn't happening. So bravo on you for taking the initiative, also with Dr. Gupta from Oxford, the three of you coming together. Now, were you surprised by the reaction? Did you realize that you had released a, dare I say, metaphorically, a bomb into the public square? Because I was quite taken aback by the vigorous attacks on it.
So, I mean, for me, it was extraordinary. When we released it, it was clear it had gone viral immediately. It was put on a little web page, and you could sign, and thousands and thousands of people, including very, very prominent scientists, signed on immediately. The thing spread worldwide. People started sending us translations from every.
Oh, is that right?
Language. Yeah. So, like, if you look on the website, I think there's Martin will know, but like 30 or 40 translations that people just volunteered to us from every. So it definitely struck a positive chord in a lot of people. But I think it also struck a negative chord in the set of people who were managing the pandemic. Because 4 days after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, Francis Collins, the head of the National Institute of Health, wrote an email to Tony Fauci, calling the three of us who had written the declaration, Martin Kulldorff, me, and Sunetra Gupta, fringe epidemiologists, and then called for a devastating takedown of the premises. And then I started getting calls from reporters asking me why I want to let the virus rip. In effect, why I want to let grandma die. What was wrong with me that I would do this?
No, it's unbelievable. And just to clarify, those emails came out much later or after, right? Through freedom of information requests, right? So you have, arguably, for our audience, just so they realize this, Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, the National Institute of Health, was really arguably one of the world's largest funders of health policy research information. And those emails revealed frankly, a directive to his subordinates, including Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx as well, to basically attack this declaration, but not just attack it, but to go after you guys. Is that right? This is outrageous.
Yeah, so there was slander, etc. But I mean, they don't have the arguments on their side. If they had the arguments on their side, they would use those arguments to.
Exactly.
But since they don't, they have to use slander and censoring, and that's exactly what they did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly in retrospect, we know. In fact, I think it was just yesterday that we found out that reports are tabled showing literally the transfers of money from the U.S. government, among others, to big tech and others to really manage the message, which is kind of frightening, is it not?
Well, I mean, what happened was that I mean, you want to. I've been thinking about why would they do this? Why would they organize this campaign to smear us, to damage our reputation, and essentially to like a propaganda campaign? Why did they do that?
Mm-hmm.
Because they were instituting a lockdown that was absolutely extraordinary in scope and damage to the population at large. If there is not a consensus of scientists, meaning like an overwhelming, near unanimous consensus in favor of such an extraordinary policy, then there's no moral basis for implementing it. Tony Fauci and Francis Collins and Jeremy Farrar in the UK, who's the head of the Wellcome Trust, and some of the other very top scientific funders around the world and science bureaucrats around the world, at the top of the financing hierarchies of science, decided that they wanted to create an illusion of consensus that did not actually exist in the scientific community. Because it was only if there was a consensus they could get their way on policy. They could then tell political leaders, you must do this because the scientific consensus around the world overwhelmingly is in favor of this. When we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, we shattered that illusion of consensus. And so that's what posed an enormous problem for these scientific bureaucrats. And so they wielded the power that they had over the funding of scientists, over the connections they had with the media, to wage a propaganda war against the ideas of the Great Barrington Declaration, because they needed to create to maintain this illusion of consensus that we had shattered just by writing this little document.
Wow, what a stunning moment. And the difference that you made as three leading healthcare experts to come forward, quite frankly, was courageous. And I guess my question is, and we could go through layers of this, much like the layers of an onion, but we look institutionally at different communities, including the professionals. And I know that there were many good examples of people like yourself coming forward, but the silence was kind of deafening in terms of people almost, dare I say, being fearful. Why is that? Like, what happened? Where were these other leaders? They seem to be missing in action.
I mean, I think part of the problem here is that you have, if you have a scientific funder like Francis Collins or Tony Fauci saying, this is the right policy, this is the consensus, if you're funded by them, your livelihood is at stake. But it's more than that. In the United States, at least, the funding by the NIH makes or breaks scientific careers in biomedicine. If you don't have funding from the NIH, then it's very difficult to get tenure at top medical universities or medical schools. And so you have the social consensus that's created by this enormous power wielded by scientific bureaucrats. In effect, they violated an implicit conflict of interest. There's a conflict of interest when scientific funders get involved so heavily in health policy. People censor themselves, scientists censor themselves, because they don't want the careers damaged. Many people wrote to me after we released the Great Barrington Declaration saying that they agreed with me, but that they were afraid to speak up. People in my own university did this. And conversely, there were people who signed the Great Barrington Declaration who lost their jobs, who had opportunities to work on grants taken away, that faced recrimination. I personally faced death
Jay, can you repeat that again? There's people who signed the declaration and they lost their job.
Yes. Yeah,
that's absurd. Why? On what basis?
I I mean, the basis is essentially that that they were somehow violating their commitments to being a scientist by articulating their scientific ideas. I mean, there was no legitimate basis. It was just an exercise in raw power. So what the idea is that, like, somehow if you disagreed with the lockdowns, you were being irresponsible, especially if you were a scientist, you were being irresponsible by voicing your concerns about the lockdowns. It was a very scary moment for science and for society, I think, to be in a position where just making a statement like this required bravery. It shouldn't require any bravery. It just should be the norm that scientists can voice their thinking in their professional fields about what the right policy should be, what scientific conclusions are. The norm in science is discussion and debate, not this kind of suppression and censorship that we saw characterize science in 2020.
So is this not a seminal moment then? Sorry, Dr. Calder?
It's true there were many people who were self-censored among science, but there was also many scientists as well as regular people who were speaking out, but they couldn't get much of an audience because of how the media operates regarding the pandemic. In terms of how Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and LinkedIn are censoring people who's going against the prevailing narrative. So there were many people who tried really hard to speak up, but who didn't manage to get it through because of these silencing and censoring tactics that were going on. And I just want to sort of say a thank you and appreciation for everybody who did that. Because even if each person didn't reach a lot of people, together a lot of people were reached by all of these people who did speak up.
So just to get some reality therapy on that, to yourselves personally, what has that been like to be so attacked, Martin and Jay? Like, I mean, I know we've talked in other contexts, but the amount of vigorous attack by different parties has been really quite astounding. How have you coped with that? How has that been for you?
Well, we have to distinguish between two things. One is if some anonymous troll on Twitter says something silly, that doesn't affect me at all. That's just part of the whole thing, and that's something that one has to just accept, that that's part of society now. So that, I think, is a non-issue. It is troubling when other scientists use slander to silence debate, because that means that other people will be afraid to speak up. That silences the scientific discussion. So I think that's very, very dangerous when scientists go after and slander others. And of course, we have been on the receiving end of that. It's especially a concern, of course, when people at high level, like Anthony Fauci, engage in those kinds of activities.
Indeed.
Well, for me personally, it was like Martin said, it's some random person. I mean, I'd go on TV or I would write an op-ed. I would routinely receive death threats or like racist attacks.
My oh my!
But none of that really. I'm not bothered by any of that, honestly. What bothered me more was attacks by people that I used to respect. And I think and I completely agree with Martin. The big problem is that those attacks were really not actually aimed at me. The main purpose of those attacks was to maintain this illusion of consensus, to silence other people. Honestly, I think we're effective. A lot of scientists that should have spoken up, a lot of professionals that should have spoken up, stayed on the sideline because they wanted to avoid the abuse that they saw me, Martin, Sinetra, and others facing. And so I agree with Martin. I am so grateful to the people that did speak up, that stuck their neck out at great personal cost, because that's how we arrived at a point where the public understands that the lockdowns were not truly necessary, and it's how we're and it's the great credit of the many people in the scientific community who did stick their necks out, that people will look back on this era and say, look, there were voices opposed to it.
Indeed. So well said, and bravo again to you. I know that in the Canadian context, so much of our media now has received government funding. So there's yet another impetus, if you will, to follow that kind of message or narrative that that those authorities are pushing. And I think it's fascinating because in retrospect now we see all kinds of information and data come out that shows in retrospect that the statements like the Great Barrington Declaration were spot on. It proves it all in retrospect. It's quite amazing. So you must feel vindicated in some measure, do you?
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
I think we were right, and I think there was never any doubt in my mind that we would be eventually proven right. But it's very bittersweet because there was so much damage done, so much collateral damage from these lockdowns. And while we managed to sort of pop the bottle of consensus, and we had some influence, for example, in Florida, we failed to get the world to reverse course until much later.
And I have to say, for me, it's less about vindication, although that is a nice thing. The main thing is, to me, is like so much damage has been done, David. So many kids have lost opportunities for schooling. So many people, the estimates are of starvation and poverty as a consequence of the economic dislocation caused by lockdown in poor countries is just heartbreaking to look at. In countries like Canada, in the UK, throughout Europe, and even in the United States, you're seeing a large number of people who skipped basic preventative treatment. It still hasn't been done. So to me, the main thing now is less about vindication and more about how do we start to address those harms? How do we start to mitigate some of the damage that's been done? That's where we need to be turning our conversation. We do also need to have an honest conversation about how lockdowns have failed, that we still haven't had that at the official high level. The use of propaganda techniques, as you say, the co-option of state-run media to push this propaganda, all of that, those discussions need to happen so that we don't make those same mistakes again, never do it again. But at the same time, we need to start addressing the harms that have been done and mitigate those harms. Just to take one, how many kids don't know how to read? How many 7, 8-year-olds don't know how to read now because they were supposedly taught to read over Zoom? We need to like a widespread literacy program to start. The kids that are developmentally have been delayed as a consequence of forced mask wearing, so they don't have the same kind of sort of normal social training they would get. How do we start to mitigate that? These are not damage. This is damage that has been done, but that could be mitigated. We should turn our attention to mitigating it.
Totally agree. The importance now of looking to healing and recovery is so apparent in society at so many levels. And just to pick up on that, it's fascinating that we talked earlier about fear. And you must have seen in so many levels the kind of fear narrative that was led by authorities. And as working in public health in another life, we were always taught that that's the exact opposite way to approach things. You should be approaching things with evidence and facts and confidence, and frankly, building community relationships. But we took a totally opposite approach. So what does that whole fear narrative, how will that impact our society, especially as we look at people now look at vaccines with skepticism? And we need vaccines, but now there's almost the sense that I have never seen such a low level of confidence or trust in public health authorities. Is that a fair comment?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what public health authorities did was violate public trust. When you intentionally use fear to manage and control the behavior of populations, it's going to have consequences. The vast amount of psychological damage that's been done to the population by the lockdowns it's hard to overstate. Even by June of 2020, 1 in 4, according to a CDC survey, 1 in 4 young adults had seriously considered suicide the previous month, in June of 2020. The levels of anxiety and depression in the population at large are at catastrophic levels. And there's still a very large number of people, a distressingly large number of people that are restricting their lives in very harmful ways because of fear of a virus that there's already widespread immunity to, and that there's treatments for and vaccines for. We have basically, through public health, committed a truly unethical thing. And the consequences, you say, has been a collapse in trust in public health. I've been looking at, for instance, the uptake in childhood vaccines around the world where lockdowns have happened, and it's unfortunately has taken a big hit. It's not a surprise that polio has returned to the United States. It's not a surprise that the measles outbreaks in Africa. It's not a surprise that the compliance with public health orders that are reasonable, that do have evidence behind them, have collapsed, in large part because public health violated the trust of the public. It's interesting, like in Sweden doesn't have a vaccine mandate, yet they got a tremendously high vaccine uptake. Why is that? Because they trusted the people, and the people trusted them back. That's the right model. Public health adopted techniques that were guaranteed to demolish trust, creating panic, adopting propaganda, and mandates. Those are all evidence of failures of public health.
Dr. Koldorf, were you going to add anything to that as well?
No, I agree with
You
everything.
summarized it beautifully. Well, look, I want to then just pick up on a thread there, because our audience may not realize that you have advised different decision makers, including former President Donald Trump, as well as Governor DeSantis, among others. To what extent does leadership make a difference in your observations as this train wreck unfolded in real time? What were those meetings like? Without betraying confidence, are there lessons to be learned there in terms of leadership and the importance of it?
Well, one thing that has surprised me is that, and maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, is that world leaders, political leaders, they just tend to follow each other. It's like just in a herd mentality. And I think that's very, very dangerous. We can contrast that with how Winston Churchill was operating during the Second World War. He had different generals come in and arguing with each other about what was the best decisions to make. And then he was listening and he made a decision. In this case, the politicians were not wanting to hear different viewpoints. They just wanted to hear the herd mentality viewpoint. And I think any politician worth anything would listen to multiple viewpoints and not only listen to them, but also have them discuss with each other.
Even have debate? Are you saying, Martin, debate is actually appropriate?
Yeah, maybe that's a very obscure viewpoint, but I do think so, yes.
You know, David, it's funny. I sometimes, when I talk to honest politicians, and there are some, they blame politicians for this herd mentality. When I talk to honest journalists, and again, there are some, they blame journalists for not speaking up, for not asking the right questions, for not pushing. They blame, but when I talk to honest scientists, they blame scientists for not speaking up. I have to say, I think, like thinking about a politician in the midst of this, you have essentially a dishonest scientific bureaucracy telling them that there's this consensus in favor of lockdown, and if they don't lock down, they're going to kill millions of people. Millions of people will die as a consequence of their decision not to lock down. It's very difficult to push back unless you have tremendous moral courage and a curiosity to go seek out other viewpoints, which is unfortunately not as prevalent as you would hope among our political leaders or our journalists or frankly even our scientists. And so what happened is that I personally blame the scientific bureaucracy. They put many politicians on a nearly impossible place. If you didn't follow the science, if Tony Fauci says, if you question me, you're not simply questioning a man, you're questioning science itself. Well, then you're going to get blamed for whatever that result is. And conversely, if you agree with what Tony Fauci wants, you won't get blamed, even if the results are terrible. And so if you actually go seek out debate and discussion and don't agree to what Tony Fauci wanted you to do, you would get hit pieces put at you. Like the Georgia governor, I think in summer of 2020, made some overtures to opening schools. He got a piece written about him in the Atlantic with a headline of "An Experiment in Human Sacrifice."
Oh, for Pete's sake!
Yeah, no politician wants that.
Wow. So, Janice's famous book years ago comes to my mind, Groupthink, where we have to be conscious about how we create a healthy level of debate and discussion. It begs, frankly, in my mind, certainly in the Canadian case, important questions about our culture. Do we have a culture, although it's very nice, but do we enable a culture that allows for respectful candor, that you can speak up and do so respectfully and gracefully? And I think that's certainly part of our, quote, classical liberal tradition, isn't it? To be able to have a freedom of discussion and respect for each other's points of view, even though, we may not disagree. We do appreciate each other as human beings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fundamental to liberal democratic norms. But that was violated. Uh, like in Canada is a good example of this. When we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, the CBC it put a panel together that essentially attacked us. They three other sort of government chosen scientists that then attacked attacked the Great Barrington Declaration, slandered us as wanting to let the virus rip, essentially called us irresponsible people. There was a lawyer in Canada that reproached Martin and me, saying, "Look, you can you can ask the ombudsman of the CBC to try to let you have your viewpoints online." And the ultimate response was, "No, we covered you guys fairly. We're not going to have your point of view out." I mean, I was managed.
Sorry, can you repeat that? They said they didn't want to hear your point of view.
Yeah, they said that they covered us fairly by slandering us. I mean, in effect, the Canadian press would not fairly, like the official Canadian press, like the CBC, would not provide us a forum to defend our thoughts, to have the debate that I think Canadian people deserved.
Very disappointing. So in that context, I mean, that in Canada we had so many issues unfold, not the least of which was, dare I say, a pattern with some governments. I would suggest the federal government towards this almost kind of an authoritarian control and lockdown that encouraged the provinces to follow their lead by actually funding that and all kinds of actions. So in this context, we found out all kinds of revelations for the public record. For example, in Canada, we learned that our health agency tracked some 33 million cell phones during COVID-19. They claim that this was to, quote, help them understand the possible links between the movement of population within Canada and COVID-19. So does that surprise you? I mean, I know there's so many examples we could cite regarding this, but how does that jive with good, again, public health policy and building a sense of trust and consent with the population?
I was shocked, David, by the Canadian response, and in particular the violation of basic civil liberties. But I saw pictures of violent arrests of pastors who wanted to hold services. When the big trucker event happened protest happened in Ontario, rather than allowing the normal protest, normally you'd have these kinds of protests, would you allow that to happen even if you disagree with it as a government. But instead, what happened was essentially a brutal crackdown, including the freezing of the assets of people who donated to
Shocking.
the vilification of people in the most vile ways officially by the government, by your prime minister. It was I think a tremendous violation of the norms of civil society. We who live in Western democracies have become accustomed to allowing there to be this kind of dissent that happens, even when there's strong feelings. You allow people to protest so that they can express it, even on both sides. That is central to democratic norms, the liberal democratic norms. And Canadians during the pandemic, in effect, were not living in a liberal democracy. They were living in an authoritarian state, in my view.
Indeed. Yeah, and the imposition of the, quote, Emergency Measures Act or martial law was all in retrospect, not based on what appears to be any evidence. Anything, the statements were made by the ministers that somehow they were doing this on the advice of police authorities or others is actually in retrospect simply not true. So if we look at some of the other kind of top of mind current issues, we look at the push now to vaccinate children of all things. Does that make any sense?
I'll let Martin speak because he's the vaccine safety expert.
So the vaccines, if you haven't had COVID, let's say you are 85 years old, then I think it's a very good idea to take the vaccine. But if you have had COVID, then you have natural immunity. Natural immunity is superior to immunity from the vaccine. So then you don't need a vaccine. And if you have a child, your risk of COVID is minuscule, and you don't need a vaccine.
Okay. So immunity is important. So if we look at, for example, I have a quote here, actually. I'd like to read it to you. It's on natural immunity. It says, since the Athenian plague of 430 BC, we have known about natural immunity. So it's strange that suddenly people are questioning that. And you also said, Dr. Kuldorf, attacking herd immunity is like attacking gravity. Why did you say that?
Well, herd immunity is a scientifically proven phenomena. If enough people have immunity, then the virus cannot spread in an epidemic manner. It will still exist in an endemic fashion, but it can spread and do a lot of harm. So to argue whether herd immunity exists or not, that's like arguing whether gravity exists. And to talk about a herd immunity strategy, it doesn't make any sense, because whatever we do with the pandemic, we will eventually reach herd immunity. It's like having two pilots flying an airplane up in the air and say, well, should we use a gravity strategy to get to land the plane or not? Whatever they do, the plane will eventually hit the ground. And the point is to hit the ground with as few casualties as possible. And when it comes to the pandemic, we will eventually reach herd immunity. And the point is we want to minimize the mortality on our way there.
So are we out of this pandemic now?
I think a lot of places are very close to that. What herd immunity looks like for this disease is a decoupling of cases and deaths. Widespread immunity in the population means that while you can have reinfections, you absolutely can. And new variants will come up that will evade the protection you get against infection in the future. At the same time, those infections, the second time you're infected, the third time you're infected, or if you had the vaccine and then subsequently infected, the probability of dying or being hospitalized is much less than it once was. The infection fatality rate in the early days of the pandemic was something like 0.2, 0.3, 0.4%, meaning 99.8%, 99.6% survival for the population at large. Much higher survival for young people and lower survival for old people, maybe 95% survival for old people, 99.9999% survival for young people or for children. Now it's even better because so many people have had the infection, recovered, or had that vaccine, and therefore have some protection against severe disease. And so the cases will come. We're going to have outbreaks over and over again into forever. This is now I think the fifth circulating coronavirus. It will cause people to get sick over and over again, but it will be much less likely to cause the level of damage, death and hospitalizations that it did in the early days of the pandemic, because we're not immune naive anymore.
So there are some places, I think, where the pandemic is over. I think there's also places definitely where, like China, where it's not over. China is going to continue to have issues and problems with this pandemic, and they're sort of just pushing it with their draconian measures. They're just pushing the problem into the future. Canada, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if there's another fairly serious wave this winter. We know that COVID is seasonal. So, but it's sort of it's very hard to predict the future of pandemic, and I think a lot of time and efforts has been wasted about trying to predict it. But it could very well be another wave, pandemic wave in Canada this winter.
I want to shift our conversation a little bit to the world of vaccines. So we know that the vaccines have had some success of sorts. I mean, I'm just using my own case as an example. I got 2 shots, and I still got COVID-19. I think it was the Omicron variant. So regardless, it seems like there's a lot of reports, and I'm not sure how to evaluate them as you are. You're the experts, but a lot of concern about vaccine impacts. I believe it was this week that the Federal Department of Federal Drug Administration in the United States has actually put under seal autopsies from persons who've had vaccine impacts and tragically passed away from them. So what is going on here? Were these really vaccines? I know they were put on a quote Operation Warp Speed. They were put through the system and approvals rather quickly. There's a lot of money to be had. How do you respond to these very real concerns about vaccination and its impact on healthy people, especially when you had this mixed technology and the whole world of gain of function research that the concerns that this will change people. So could we look to you for some sanity on this?
So if we take a step back first and also what's the quality of these vaccines? So these are not great vaccines.
So they're not great vaccines.
They're not great in the sense that they don't prevent transmission. If you have the vaccine, you will still get COVID. What they do is that they, for older people, they reduce the risk of severe disease. So that's their contribution, and I think it was very impressive to get out the vaccine so quickly. As with any vaccines and any medical procedures, there's always a risk for adverse reactions. I think this has more than most vaccines. One of the more concerning, serious ones is myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart, which we've especially seen in young males. So there are adverse reactions to it, but then you have to sort of look at what is the benefit and the risks. So if you are 85 years old and you haven't had COVID, then the benefit of the vaccine is high because you have a high risk of COVID. So even if there is a small risk of some adverse reactions, it's still worth taking it because the balance is more towards the benefit. On the other hand, if you are a 15 or a 20-year-old, the benefit of the vaccine is minuscule because your risk of mortality is very, very small. You'll get it, but then you will recover. So then even if the risk from the vaccine is small, it means that since the benefit is even smaller, then why take the vaccine?
So if we look at younger, healthy people, don't take the vaccine. But if you're an older person, then look at this as a way to prevent healthcare impacts. Is that right?
Yeah, and we're exactly where the cutoff is that can be discussed, and we don't really know. But in general terms, yes, that's I think the right approach.
The other angle there is that if you've had COVID and recovered already, you already have pretty good protection against a reinfection and severe reinfection. The marginal benefit for the vaccine for people who have had COVID and recovered is very small compared to someone who's immune naive, who's never had COVID before. And so even if you're older and you've had COVID, should you get an additional dose? I mean, it's possible. It might make some sense, but it should be something that's left to a discussion between you and your doctor, not something that's forced on you by mandate or by coercion.
So you should actually have a conversation with your doctor.
Yeah, you should. I mean, I think the doctor, like if you've had COVID and recovered, and you're older and you're vulnerable, maybe you need the vaccine again, but it's not certain. If you haven't had COVID and recovered and you're older, I think it's very wise to get the vaccine.
Okay.
But I think it's a personal thing that's going to be based on your personal medical condition, not something that is you can make a blanket statement for everyone is equally true for everyone. It's not right.
What was the average age of mortality in most jurisdictions around the world? I think in Canada, I believe the last time I checked was around 84, and those persons had multiple comorbidities, serious health issues. Is that consistent with other jurisdictions as well?
Yes. So I think something like 80% of the deaths have been people over the age of 65 worldwide. Something on that order. The typical age of death is someone in their 80s. The average age of death. And of course, that doesn't mean that younger people haven't died with this. It
Yes.
is they have, but the rates are small, and relative to the risks that younger people face from the lockdowns, the lockdown harms are much greater for them. So this is a disease of older people, primarily in terms of the risk of bad impacts of death, hospitalizations, and so on.
Well, look, we've had a very far-reaching discussion today, and as we look to wrap up here, I did want to ask you for some advice, and that is, I know that both of you have spoken about the importance of renewing so many of our institutions, including science, and frankly, looking to rebuild our society. What advice do you have to do that as we look to the future? The new year is just around the corner, as well as hope for citizens and what they can do.
Well, in terms of the scientific community, I think we have to, we can't have this very centralized system where a few people sit on top of the funding agencies. People out there are afraid to speak up against there. So we have to decentralize how the funding of science works, as well as how publication of science operates with the scientific journals. We could see during this pandemic that powerhouses like the US and UK, like scientific powerhouses, were not the ones who came up with the important early discoveries on COVID. It came from smaller countries who are advanced countries, but smaller, like, for example, Denmark, Israel, Qatar, Sweden, Iceland, where they have a good research infrastructure, but they're not as dependent on these centralized funding agencies. So a lot of the best studies came out from these countries, and I think that shows that we need to decentralize science so that there's less of group thing and less of a cartel system among a few scientists who sort of control their particular field. Now that's in the scientific community, but I think the problem is more widespread to society. We have to defend freedom of speech, for example, which I never thought we would. I have taken that for granted throughout my life. So, but at this point, we defend that.
It's unbelievable. What about you, Dr. Bhattacharya?
I think I agree with Martin about the problems that the pandemic has exposed in the scientific community, as well as the broader problems in society of our governance. I do think that there's an opportunity here, a real opportunity to reform our societies on a more healthy basis, and I mean healthy not just in terms of public health and like physical health, but also sort of social health. We have found that when a big threat happens, our first instincts of our leaders, of our society, is to protect rich laptop class people at the expense of children, at the expense of working class people. That's something that's really important that we've learned as a consequence of the pandemic. We first offered tests we offered lockdowns that could only benefit a certain class of people at the expense of less wealthy people, less well-off people, working class people. I think that's a really important understanding, and it's created interesting political coalitions that have brought together people on the left and right that don't want that want public health that's focused on protecting vulnerable people, that want public health that respects basic civil liberties like freedom of speech. And I think that and the the right to have your child to have an education, right? Something that I took for granted before the pandemic. Those kinds of basic discoveries, I think, are going to be very important in shaping the politics of our societies going forward. And I actually am optimistic that in coming years, the lessons will get learned from this, and that we reform our systems of scientific funding, our systems of public health and advice, our systems of declarations of emergency, all of these kinds of problems that have occurred, these sort of errors that led to the disastrous lockdowns, have created a class of people who were harmed. They'll have a very strong interest in that reform, and I'm optimistic that political coalition can be brought together to enact those reforms.
Well said, Dr. J. Bhattacharya and Dr. Martin Kulldorff. It's been delightful to have this discussion with you today, and thank you for your wisdom and your courage, as well as a vision for hope and recovery as we come out of this historic moment. And so thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, David.
Well, thank you, David.
So on behalf of Frontier and all of us today, we're very grateful that we could have this discussion. And at Frontier, this important conversation will continue as we seek to learn and actively support the efforts to hold more public inquiries and the impacts and lessons learned about COVID-19. So be sure to stay tuned and subscribe to our newsletter. And be sure to join us on our next Leaders on the Frontier on October the 20th with renowned senior fellow Michael Zagstra on education. Some things are fundamental as we discuss the markers of high-performing education and, frankly, the problems of indoctrination. So that brings today's session to a close. Be sure to look at our website and check our channels on YouTube and now Rumble. Thank you for all of you who donate to Frontier. You allow us to do our work. We are nonpartisan, and we do not accept any government funding. And remember, without open discussion and debate, you are not thinking, and nor are you free. So keep asking good questions and do not be afraid. And on behalf of all of us at Frontier, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.